feel like I might have just gone. What the hell is going on? Am I supposed to suck in? It's forbidden. So you've heard that board games are the new thing, and you wander into your local board game cafe, or you seek out a board game cafe or board game store, and you see this. And your mind does this. As someone who has worked in a board game cafe and hung out in a board game shop, mostly playing games, I have seen that look. I have seen that look of, what have I gotten myself into? When I first started playing and collecting board games, I sought out a video on YouTube that didn't exist, which I'm kind of hoping this will fit into, which is the idea of, hey, it's okay to be intimidated by this world. Here's a very basic guideline of the bits and pieces you need to do. Now, granted, you can pick this up by yourself, but there's a good chance there are people out there who will just be intimidated into fleeing into the night. So hopefully this video is aimed for them. This video is for you. If you want to get into the world of board games, I'm going to give you a crash course in the board game hobby. What this basically means is that there's a big disconnect between the mainstream and the hobby. Mainstream games being things you would have found in Toys R Us back in the day. So your Monopolies and your Cluedos and your Operation and your Twister and all these kind of games that you know. And then the hobby games, which is the big shelf of games that you look at and you think, what the hell is that? That's that big shelf of games, the hobby games. There is a huge disconnect here. This disconnect doesn't really exist in other forms of media. Yes, there will be people, be cinephiles who love independent film, funny, quirky little cinema, but they'll also probably be perfectly fine with the mainstream cinema. And it's fine to watch the mainstream cinema, which is perfectly good, and not dive deep into obscure indie French something or other that people like me watch and that you've never heard of. There's always going to be a mainstream and a fringe, but in most other mediums they kind of work. You can be into both quite happily. In board games, not so much. The mainstream and the fringe or the hobby are very separate entities. Now that I'm a hobby gamer, I would almost certainly never play a mainstream game. I mean, I've played Cluedo recently because you have family and people who want to play a game they're familiar with, but I would never volunteer a game of Monopoly, for example. And you might go into one of these board game cafes, see the massive shelf of games, not know what to do, and end up playing Monopoly. And the staff at the board game cafe can't stop you from playing Monopoly, but they should. They should stop you. Because Monopoly's bad. It's a bad game. And not to sound too stobby, but this is literally the case. The mainstream games are generally bad, and the hobby games are good. It's a whole world you haven't heard of that is so much vastly superior to the world you have heard of that it will just make your head spin. It will kind of blow your mind, which is why it's exploded. So once people found the hobby games, the reason it exploded is because it's so vastly superior. Why is this? I could deep dive into why that would be, but that could be a very long video. The basics of it, as I would say, comes down to a kind of luck mitigation. A lot of mainstream games have no learning curve. They're very luck heavy. Like, I wouldn't play a chess grandmaster in chess, but I would quite happily play them in Snakes and Ladders, a game that requires no skill whatsoever. There's a lot of dice rolling and hoping to hit the right thing, and that's easy to play. Like, there's strategy for sure. Like, and if you're playing a Trivial Pursuit, then you've got to know stuff. If you're playing Monopoly, then making right moves at the right time. Monopoly's relatively strategic for a mainstream game, but making the right moves at the right time there's some strategy involved. But a lot of them are heavily reliant on rolling the dice and landing on the right thing. And being able to do what you need to do. So there's a heavy amount of luck in the mainstream, whereas the hobby games tend to remove that significantly. There are very, very, very few. I can't immediately name any roll to move hobby games. There must be some, but I can't think, because it's not a popular mechanic, because it's too heavily luck based. And hobby games tend to be more strategic. They tend to be a bit more in that chessy kind of thinky kind of way. I said that in a super intelligent way, didn't I? And then you start playing these more strategy, more cerebral games, it does sour you to the alternative. Like suddenly you can just roll dice and anyone can win just because of whatever they've happened to have done, and it's just a bit. You want to be winning because you're doing better, rather than just being lucky. So that's where that is. That's mainstream versus hobby. You will never find, I don't think in any medium you will find a bigger disconnect between the mainstream and the hobby than you will in board games, which is partly why you've never heard of most of the hobby games. Which is it's a very strange setup, which is why it's so intimidating, I imagine, to look at when people come into, when I used to work at Cakes and Ladders, and people would come in for the first time and be like, I don't know where to start. Just look at the shelves of games and have no idea where to start. The way I would approach conversations with them is I would ask them what sort of thing they liked. And they didn't always understand the question, but I was trying to break down their potential likes into categories. Now, there's always some fairly safe bets that most people will enjoy, like Ticket to Ride. And Settlers of Catan normally goes down pretty well as well. I always suggest Small World if people have got even a vaguely risk kind of like. If you have a liking for risk, I'd always recommend Small World because it's one of my favourite games by far. It's just super easy and super fun. But yeah, I was trying to break it down into categories because board games come in a wild variety of categories that you may have never even heard of. There's mechanics, there's styles, there's things like, the list can be co-op, abstract, dexterity, collectible card games or CCGs, roll and write, worker placement. There's all of these categorizations for board games that will mean nothing to you, but that's what I was trying to break down their understanding of games into. Here's something that the mechanics of which will not be too complex for you to feed into from other games. I'm not trying to simplify things for people, but there is definitely a learning curve in the hobby board game world, and it's huge. There's a huge difference between, say, like Ticket to Ride, which you may have heard of, and Twilight Imperium, which is way up the top of the scale. And there's things even above Twilight Imperium, your diplomacies and your probably some 18xx games that I'm unfamiliar with, and all these things that heavy economic. See, I'm saying words again that, aren't going to mean that much to you because they're jargon. You're going to get bogged down in jargon if you're not too careful. And that's where people are going to kind of lose interest and get the disconnect there. So I'm going to try and avoid that. Again, I could make a video just explaining all the jargon, but it would take too long. That being said, I'm going to mention two categories that you're likely to come across when you first start looking into it, and they are Euro and Ameritrash. Ameritrash isn't a great term because it sounds bad, doesn't it? Ameritrash. I don't know if there's a better word for that. I saw someone once suggest Amerithrash, which is quite good. But what they basically mean, Euro and Ameritrash basically means mechanics and theme. And that boils down to Euro games being more mechanic focused, games where you're moving your pieces to optimize your ability to score points or do whatever the victory condition of the game is, but often scoring points. And Ameritrash means more thematic games with a heavy theme, a story focus, games where what you're doing matches the story of the game in as many ways as possible. And as anything, the best of those games will swing somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. There'll be a good combination of mechanics and theme, mechanics that support the theme or theme that support the mechanics, or just a interesting story of a game that is still very cerebral to play. But those are the ends of the spectrum, Euro and Ameritrash. And if somebody says Euro, what they mean is mechanic heavy. What they mean is they're more chess-like in some way. Assuming you don't have a handy nerd friend who's already into this kind of thing, who can guide you through in some way, then if you have wandered into a board game cafe or board game shop, then that's great. That's a good place to start. Either grab some friends, or there'll be some people there who can help you, or these places might have gathering nights. They might have social nights where you can just meet new people and play games. The staff will likely be board game enthusiasts themselves, so they can guide you in the right direction. And you grab a game and just play, really. That's kind of where it starts from. I'll recommend a few things at some point in this video, but yeah, really just kind of have to go for it. Another option is to find a local board games club. and they will be way more common than you think, even in like obscure places. Like I used to live in a tiny little village. Newport Pagnell had one when I used to live up that way, which is a little village near Milton Keynes. So yeah, for places will have them. If you try and search on Facebook or just search online, try and find a local board game club, then you'll probably be surprised. So just show up to one of those, meet a whole bunch of new people who are always more than happy. They're there to play games, and they'll more often than not be very happy to draw someone else into their world, get somebody else hooked, as it were. Or if you don't have that, then grab some friends, buy a game, and just play it. It's one of those things you just kind of sort of dive into. If you're not sure what games to start with, it's often good to watch videos like this video, I guess, or other review videos online, which I will go through a few of my personal favourites in a second, to get an idea of the world. But if you have any kind of gaming background, I started with a wargaming background. I was a Warhammer 40,000 player. I also had some Dungeons and Dragons and those type, RPG experiences, so I wasn't coming in completely dry. But it's still quite an intimidating world in just the sense that there are literally tens of thousands of games, and you do not know where to start or what you might enjoy. And some of them are pretty damn expensive. But it's not a cheap hobby, so you have to really be quite selective about what you buy. Some of my early purchases were based on things I saw online, just thematic things. I bought the Game of Thrones board game because I was big into Game of Thrones, and that's kind of been one of our most played games. My copy is battered. It's really beaten up because we've played it so much. I sort of originally started, I was big into the Geek and Sundry channel as a nerd, and watching the Guild. I think I started with the Guild, and then feeding into all of the Fleece Days, Geek and Sundry and everything else. And that led on to Will Wheaton's Tabletop. And I know there's been some drama. I don't know the full details of it, so don't jump down my throat if I'm now supporting something that you might consider is bad. I'm not going to get into it, but yeah, Will Wheaton's Tabletop is a really good show on the Geek and Sundry. You can find it on YouTube or on their Twitch or wherever you would watch it. And it's Will Wheaton with a small group of celebrity friends playing a board game. And there's just a bunch of episodes of them all playing different games, and I watched some of those and I was like, hey, some of these games are really good, and I kind of started buying off of that list. Like I bought Munchkin and I bought Ticket to Ride, and started all the kind of, there's a lot of gateway games on that list. There's a few slightly heavier games, but mostly it's games that work straight out the box with new players. So anything they play on there is probably going to be pretty good for pick up and play for new people. He's not playing anything wildly complex, because they're an entertainment show, so they need to be entertaining, and watching a whole bunch of people sit around a table just thinking intensely about how to optimize their next move is not that entertaining, and B, just because they want to appeal to a casual audience, which is kind of what makes the show work. I'm suggesting that one first for that reason. It is an entertainment show, so it is designed to be entertaining to people who are not hardcore nerds, hardcore board game enthusiasts, and you can graduate off of that show into like the heavier reviews and introspectives and things. But yeah, Will Wheaton's Tabletop is a good place to start. For myself, I watch the Dice Tower, which is a really good website, which is very comprehensive board game reviews and talks, and they have their own convention. They kind of go deep dive on a lot of board game based things, but it is jargon heavy. And deep into that world, and it's not that hard to get into because they're kind of entertaining guys and they know what they're doing, but they are talking to an assumed crowd of people who know about board games. They're not like spoon feeding you the simplicity of it. So jump on the Dice Tower for sure. And my other one to support some British board gamers is Shut Up and Sit Down. Shut Up and Sit Down is great. They don't produce as much content as somewhere like the Dice Tower, but they do much more deep dives, even deeper dives into the board games they review. And also they have a podcast which I listen to, and I basically listen to their podcast, wait for them to talk about, and anytime they talk about something that I like the sound of, I just make a note of it, and then I kind of look into that and think about buying it. So I've bought a lot of my collection just based on either Dice Tower reviews or Shut Up and Sit Down's podcast, just because I'm like, that sounds amazing, and then I buy it, and I usually like it. Hello, girl. You coming back? Oh, cat tail in my video now. What are you doing? The other website you might want to check out is Board Game Geek. I have so many friends who are enthusiasts of the hobby but still don't know Board Game Geek that well. Board Game Geek is quite an intimidating website. They've got a lot going on there. They've got lists for conventions and clubs and huge numbers of forums, and pretty much every game in some way or other is represented on Board Game Geek. But the primary use of it, if you go on Board Game Geek, you can go to Browse, and you can browse all games, and it will give you a comprehensive list of, I'm going to say, pretty much every game in existence, every board game existence, as ranked by people on Board Game Geek. Like, I have an account on Board Game Geek. It's a free account, and you can rank games, give them a little ranking, and then they are listed on Board Game Geek if you collect all board games as... Oh, the cat is back. Right into the microphone, Gary. Yeah, that's right. Just sit right in front of that. She's right here in front of the microphone. Just have purring in the background of my video from now on. What do you think? Look at me like that. If I stop recording, she'll jump down. I 100% guarantee it. She's a troll. You're trolling me, aren't you, Carriad? So yeah, Board Game Geek can look quite intimidating, but it is good for the list of best ranked games. As of recording this, number 1 is currently Gloomhaven, and it's probably going to be there for a little while. But yeah, you can see kind of what the geeks think the best games are, and it's normally pretty accurate. You know, so there's a lot of people contributing to these rankings. So that's a good place for just information, and then I recommend, you know, reviewing podcasts and YouTube channels and things like that, and websites for the new. Keep up with the news. Shut Up and Sit Down and the Dice Tower are my two favourites, and they're two of the bigger ones. To be fair, I'm a mainstream kind of nerd. I'd be remiss if I didn't also recommend Dice Breakers, just because I've actually been on there. I've actually been on that YouTube channel. They're also really good. But I said I'd give a few recommendations, and I will. Some basic categories. So Monopoly, I would classify as a more economic game. I think that's the interesting side of it, managing your money and building your properties. So my recommendation replacement for that is Power Grid. So if you're in a board game cafe, I would grab Power Grid if you like Monopoly. It's about building power stations on whatever the map is. The main base map is either Germany, I think, on one side, or America on the other side. And yeah, it's about building power stations and powering up, building little buildings, competing for territory, managing your money, auctioning. It's got a lot of what Monopoly is about within it, and I think it's a good graduation from that. And it's oh, there's the cat. If you want Cluedo, there's actually a game called Kill Dr. Lucky. It might be a bit hard to find now because it might have gone out of print. That's the thing about the hobby board games, is they frequently just go out of print and just are gone. Kill Dr. Lucky is basically the sequel to Cluedo, where you're trying to get a weapon, get Dr. Lucky, who is kind of the person in this manor. You're wandering about this manor trying to grab a weapon, get Dr. Lucky alone in a room and kill him. So you're trying to be so-and-so in the library with the wrench or whatever. So yeah, you're people trying to commit the murder, and all of you are moving about the house trying to kill this Dr. Lucky in this manner. Yeah, it's an interesting game. Very strategic and very kind of planning, lots of forward planning, 10 moves ahead, to be like, well, if I cut him off here and make sure there's nobody else who can witness it, because there's got to be no witnesses. Poke, poke. Oh, there she goes. She's going to sleep up there with the bear now. If you want a quiz game, so if you're into your Trivial Pursuits, which is a terrible game. Trivial Pursuits are a really terrible game. There's variations of it. I have the You Bet version of Trivial Pursuit, where you can bet on people's answers and you win poker chips, and you can then buy pie pieces with those poker chips so that you don't have to answer the questions. So that's an interesting variation, but there are much better quiz games. Obama Llama is kind of a favourite of mine at the moment. It's a really good one where you're trying to work out, the answers are usually a celebrity and an activity that rhymes together. Confident, I also quite liked. Confident is where you are guessing, you're giving it's a numbers based answer, but you can guess a range of numbers. So you can guess, well, I guess that the answer is between 50 and 60, and whoever guesses with the smallest margin gets extra points. So there's various point scoring ways. So you could just say, oh, I could spin a 0 and 1,000, and you'll be correct, but that definitely won't be the smallest margin unless everybody else guesses completely wrong. So yeah, that's really good, confident. I really like that one. If you like your operations, then a good dexterity game, because that's in the class of dexterity game, it's fairly self-explanatory. I recommend Tokyo Highway. I think is a really good game. It's where you're stacking sticks and discs in order to create this sort of highway thing, but it's kind of just an interconnected route where you can put your little cars on, and the first player to get all their cars on the highway wins. Yeah, it's a really good game, Tokyo Highway. I've already mentioned, if you like Risk, I recommend Small World. I think Small World's a great game. I'm a wargamer at heart. I started out in wargaming, so I own a fair amount of wargames. But Small World is a fantastic game. You'll pick up a race, it's set in a fantasy land, so you're a fantasy race of orcs or elves or whatever, and you take an army, and you spread out across the land, and you score points for conquering territories. But then when your army is useless or depleted or too beaten up to continue, you retire them, pick up a new army, and storm across the board all over again. So you're conquering and conquering and conquering to just optimize points. It's point optimization, really. So there's not that much war involved. It's much more about optimizing your ability to score points, but it feels like a war game, a very light war game. I think it's really good. I do recommend Small World. The two modern classics are, of course, that you've possibly already heard of, Ticket to Ride and Settlers of Catan. I mentioned them earlier. You can't really go wrong. Settlers of Catan is a bit dry for me now. Like, I've played it quite a lot, and I've got other games in my collection, so I wouldn't rush to play Settlers of Catan. I've got some expansions for it, so I still enjoy it with the expansions. But base Settlers of Catan is a little dry for me now. And the category that you may not be aware of is the co-op category. There's not that many co-op mainstream games. Co-op means it's the players working together against the game. You're trying to beat the game. The classic and possibly bad taste at the moment is Pandemic. That's quite easy to pick up. It's quite complex to win, but it's relatively easy to pick up. But another option would be, I would say, Castle Panic, which I believe they played on Will Wins Tabletop, and probably just constantly mentioning things that are on tabletop. And you're playing cards to try and fight off orcs and goblins and things that are trying to attack your tower, just trying to survive the horde. There's this army that keeps coming, and you have to basically wipe out the entire army to win the game. This is the category that I often find when I discuss it with people who come into the cafe with no knowledge of board games, that they just genuinely don't know this category exists. I might do another video later on just explaining the categories in a bit more detail. Again, I said there's too much to kind of go into, but I just wanted to cover where you should start, what you should do if you're starting in the hobby and trying to figure out what it is you want to do. You know that you want to play board games, but you have no idea where you should be starting. I wanted to create a video that was a little bit more in line with explaining that, because I'd never quite found anything online that did that before. But yeah, if you have any questions, then feel free to pop them in the comments. I will do my best to answer. Maybe if you have suggestions for, like, if there's a lot of theme in those questions, or you have suggestions for making future videos along this same idea, I may well do that. I apologise if the video is a bit janky. I'm still having some technical issues, but I will have them fixed at some point soon, when I get my new PC. Ooh. If you are stuck at home at the moment, there are online ways to play board games. Tabletop Simulator, which you can get off of Steam and probably other places, but yeah, Tabletop Simulator is one way where they have a whole bunch of simulated board games. Some of the ones that I've mentioned, some that I haven't. Quite a wide range, actually, of things that have been sort of programmed in there. So that's quite good. There's also, I run the Blood on the Clock Tower Discord server, so if you search for Blood on the Clock Tower London on Facebook, you'll find the server that I run for that social deduction game. Social deduction game being where the players are sort of working together to try and figure out who is on what team, who is good and who is bad, essentially. The Resistance is a good example, which I believe is on Will Wheaton's Tabletop. So that's hopefully some useful information on board games. Look at the cute kitten sleeping on the thing, and play some games, because games are great. Board games are great. Follow all the links below for all the things that I've been talking about, as well as my social media links and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. So, the end.